Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Bibbidi Bobbidi Books. My name is Ellie and today I am so excited because I'm going to be talking you through my top 10 books of 2021. So these are all my favourite books that I read last year. This has got to be my favourite video to watch other people do, so I'm so excited to give it a go myself and I really hope that you enjoy this video. Curating this list was really difficult. I had a fantastic reading year last year, so narrowing it down to just 10 top books was almost an impossible feat. And honestly, if you ask me in 10 minutes time, I will probably come up with a slightly different list to the books that I'm going to show you right now. But as of this second, these are all of my favourite books that I read. So yeah, without further ado, I am just going to jump straight in and start showing you these books. They're in no particular order, they are all equally wonderful in my eyes. So yeah, I'm just gonna grab and just chat and yeah, I'm waffling now, so let's jump in and start chatting about the books. So the first book that I want to chat with you about is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in his Mistborn trilogy, which is an adult epic fantasy series, and it's probably most well known for its cool magic system. In this world, there are a few rare people who have this magical ability to ingest and harness the powers of metals. So it's a skill that's called allomancy, and most people who have this skill can only ingest and burn one particular type of metal. However, there are a few even rarer people who are able to ingest and burn all of the different types of metals and harness all of their powers, and they are known as Mistborn, which is why this series is called the Mistborn series. And in this first book, we basically follow a rebellion plotline, because the whole premise of this story is what would happen if the bad guy won. So in this book, we have this evil Lord Ruler who is ruling over the Final Empire. He's been in power for as long as anyone can remember, and things are in a bad way. There is literally ash falling from the sky, the sun is red, nothing grows, or it's really hard to grow anything anyway, and the plants that do grow are just kind of brown in colour, there's no greenery. And there's also a lot of oppression in this world. Our ruler is a bit of a tyrant, and there's this entire race of people called the Scar who are heavily oppressed and basically enslaved. And in this first novel, we follow our main character Kelsier, who is a man who's basically trying to pull together a group of really skilled allomancers in order to overthrow the Lord Ruler and take over the Final Empire. And yeah, this really stood out to me. I loved this so much, in fact, that I read this book physically, and then I went on to convince my partner to read it with me again. So I reread the whole book on audio, and I enjoyed both experiences. The audiobook was actually really fantastic because it has a whole cast of characters and they use sound effects and things which make the fight scenes and everything even more exciting. So I would highly recommend this if you're looking for an audiobook. But yeah, this was loads of fun. I really enjoyed how the characters use their allomantic powers during battles and things. Was so cinematic and so cool, and I loved all the different characters. They all felt very unique and distinct, and I really had a blast reading the last kind of 150 pages or so of this book, because it is wild. There are twists and turns and reveals, and things happen that I didn't expect, and it is just so much fun. So I would highly recommend this book if you're looking to get into a new adult fantasy series, or if you're normally a YA fantasy reader and you're looking to try adult. I would recommend this book because Brandon Sanderson has a really accessible writing style. It's not too intimidating. So yeah, this is a fantastic story, so much fun, and I would highly recommend. The next book that I'm going to show you is a bit of a polarizing book, so people either seem to really love it or they really don't love it, but I'm pleased to say that I am in the love it category, and that book is The Starler C by Erin Morgenstern. Now this is a book that I find really hard to talk about because it's quite complex and it's not like anything that I've ever read before, but the main kind of premise of this story really is that we're following this college student called Zachary, and he ends up finding this book in the library, and he's really interested in this book. It contains lots of different stories and lots of different myths, but much to his surprise, it also contains a story that is literally about him. So the story depicts very clearly an event that happened to him in his childhood when he was presented with an opportunity that he didn't take. So of course our main character Zachary is very confused to find that his childhood is literally written into this book, which is seemingly older than he is. And so he ends up going on this adventure to try and uncover more about this book that he found and who wrote it. And he ends up going on this adventure to this underground library, and he finds out about this secret society, and the story basically becomes more and more weird and wonderful as we delve deeper and deeper into this underground library. And while the story kind of starts off about Zachary, I would say it's not really about Zachary. It's more about stories and storytelling, and how the decisions characters make can change the narrative, and how one moment can completely change the path of the story. It is so beautifully done, and throughout this book Erin Morgenstern weaves together different stories and different myths that are all interconnected by common themes, and it is just incredibly beautiful in my eyes. But I can completely see why some people might not necessarily like this one, because it is quite slow and it is very meandering, and a lot of the time you're not 100% sure where the author is taking you or why she's telling you things, but you just kind of have to go with it. And honestly, 90% of the time I didn't actually have a clue what was going on in this story, but I just didn't mind, because I just was really enjoying my reading experience and just being lost in the beauty of the descriptions and of the prose in this story. In fact, there was one quote that really summarized my experience of reading this book. So at one point in the story, our main character Zachary asks someone how they're feeling, and they respond by saying, "Like I'm losing my mind, but in a slow, achingly beautiful kind of way." And I think that just perfectly summarizes my experience of reading this book. Didn't have a clue what was going on half the time, but just didn't mind because it was just so beautiful. The next book that I want to talk to you about is The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. So this is the third and final book in the Winter Night trilogy, which is arguably one of my favourite series of all time. So for those of you who don't know, this series is set in medieval Russia. It's an adult series, and we basically follow our main character Vasilisa as she's growing up across the books. So in the first book she starts off as a young girl, and Vasilisa is very much a kind of wild child. She's a free spirit, and she also has this incredibly unique power in that she can see and communicate with household spirits and with spirits of the forest, which is really cool. But the story kind of kicks off when her father actually ends up remarrying, because Vasilisa's mother died in childbirth. So her father ends up bringing back this new wife from Moscow, and his new wife is actually a devout Orthodox Christian. So she very much does not agree with Vasilisa's way of life, and she is incredibly afraid. She thinks that the kind of household spirits that Vasilisa can communicate with are in fact demons, and so her stepmom basically ends up bringing this priest to town in order to try and cast out all of these spirits, and things start to go wrong from there. It is incredible, this series. It is so atmospheric. The writing is beautiful, and there's also some really interesting themes of kind of the use of fear to control people, and organized religion versus kind of folklore and fairy tales. And this series contains one of my favorite villains ever. I really enjoyed the priest character. I found him fascinating, and I also really enjoyed the kind of weird dynamic and tension between him and Vasilisa in these stories. It was fascinating. This whole series is amazing. I would highly recommend this one. As I said before, this is probably one of my favorite series ever. I would also recommend this to you if you are a fan of historical fiction and are looking to get into fantasy, because this also weaves in some of those historical elements. So yeah, wonderful conclusion to a wonderful series. The next book that I want to talk to you about is A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. So this is the second book in her Wayfarers series, which is a sci-fi adult series, and I actually think that I enjoyed this second book even more than the first book, which is saying something because I thought the first book was fantastic. But in this story we basically follow our main character Pepper, who does actually make an appearance in the first books, and we have a past and a present timeline in here. I can't talk too much about the present timeline because that would give away some spoilers for some of the events that happened in the first book, but in the past timeline we basically follow Pepper as a child, and we find out that she was a bioengineered human slave, and she ends up breaking free from the processing plant that she worked in, and she spends a number of years having to live in this junkyard trying to survive, and she is helped along the way by this AI called Owl, who basically teaches her how to mend and to rebuild this spaceship in order for her to be able to get off world. This book feels really different to the first book. I feel like it feels a lot more intimate because we're focusing in on less characters, but I just absolutely adore all of Becky Chambers' books. They are all fantastic, and what I really love about her stories is that they are always quite hopeful in the end. So I feel like a lot of adult sci-fi books tend to be quite negative. They tend to have quite a pessimistic outlook on our future, whereas Becky Chambers does always kind of provide that positivity, and they do often have a nice uplifting ending. So yeah, I love this book and cannot wait to get to the rest of the books in this series. The next book that I want to talk to you about is Hollypox by Jessica Townsend. So this is the third book in the Nevermore series, which is a wonderful middle grade series. It's actually probably one of my favourite middle grade series ever. That's how much I love it. And yeah, for those of you who don't know, this series follows our main character Morrigan Crow, who is a young girl, and she is believed to be cursed because she is born on this really unlucky day called Eventide, and all of the children who are born on Eventide are actually fated to die on their, I think it's their 11th birthday. But Morrigan Crow basically ends up being rescued. She gets saved by this man called Jupiter North, who whisks her off to this magical world called Nevermore, and he enters her into a series of trials in order to win a place in the Wanderer Society, which is this kind of magical organization. And it is so much fun. I love this series. It's so creative. Morrigan ends up living in this magical hotel where the hotel rooms kind of change according to your mood, and the head of housekeeping is this giant talking cat, and it is just so fun. If I could choose to kind of jump into any magical world, I think I would choose Nevermore because it is so wild and so fun and imaginative. Okay, so the next book that I want to talk to you about is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. So this is actually a horror book, and it's actually the first horror book that I've ever read, and I would highly recommend it as a good starting place for the horror genre because I really enjoyed my time with it, and I think it's perfect for newbies like me because it wasn't too scary. It was kind of a nice blend of comedy as well as kind of gruesome horror. But I really love this book. I enjoyed it a lot more than I was expecting to, and the things I loved about it were firstly the setting, because this is set in the 80s, which is so fun. Each chapter is actually titled after an 80s hit song, and I really loved all the nostalgia in here and all the 80s references. And I also enjoyed that actually at the heart of this story was a beautiful friendship. So this story is kind of exactly what it says on the tin. It's about a girl who is trying to save her best friend who we believe has been possessed, and their friendship felt really relatable to me. It was written so well. It was exactly the kind of friendship that I would have had when I was younger, and I really enjoyed their dynamic, and I was actually surprisingly moved by the ending, which is how this has ended up on my top 10 list, because yeah, I was actually surprisingly emotional by the ending of this one, which I completely was not expecting going into a horror novel. The next book that I want to talk to you about is actually a book that I didn't think would make it onto my top 10 list of books from 2021, but I just haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I put it down. So for that reason I just had to include it, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a Gothic horror novel. So this story takes place in 1950 Mexico, and we follow our main character Noemi, who is a socialite, and the story kind of kicks off when Noemi receives this letter from her cousin, who she hasn't seen for a long time because her cousin married and moved in living with her husband and his family. So this is the first time Noemi is hearing from her cousin since she moved away, and the letter that she receives is pretty strange. Her cousin makes some pretty wild accusations in this letter, and so Noemi ends up going to visit her cousin to make sure that she is okay, and the story takes on from there. I can't really say a huge amount because I don't want to get into any spoilers at all, but the whole book basically takes place in this isolated haunted mansion style setting, which is so much fun, and there's definitely a creeping sense of dread as you read this book. There's definitely a slow build up of tension. It is quite slow to begin with, so I would say kind of stick with it because the second half is definitely much more entertaining than the first half, but it gets pretty wild and pretty scary, and yeah, it was a whole lot of fun reading this. It definitely takes a turn that I wasn't expecting, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it initially, but once I kind of got on board with the direction that this book was going in, I was down for it. It was absolutely dripping with Gothic imagery, and what I really enjoyed about this was how the author managed to kind of weave in historical elements, and she also used the horror genre to kind of discuss bigger issues like misogyny and racism and colonialism, and it just made a really fun and terrifying reading experience, and I could not stop thinking about this book after I read it, so I had to put it on this list. The next book that I want to talk to you about is Empire of the Vampire by J. Christoph. Now, I filmed a spoiler-free review video for this book previously, so I'll link that down below, so I'll try and be quite brief with this one, but this is such a fun, blood-soaked, gory, Gothic vampire story, the first in an adult series, and in this story we basically follow our main character Gabriel, who is a silver saint, which is basically like a vampire hunter, and the beginning of the story starts with Gabriel in prison. So he has been incarcerated for a murder that we don't know much about, and he is essentially being forced to tell his story to a vampire. So in this book we've got 3 different timelines. We've got present day, which is when Gabriel is telling his story to the vampire, and then we've got 2 flashbacks. We've got the first one, which is when Gabriel is a lot younger, and it's kind of a coming of age story where we see how he becomes a silver saint, which is very cool. And then the second flashback is Gabriel when he's much older, and he's much more of a very kind of jaded, reluctant hero type character, and that storyline is kind of leading up to the events of now. This was pitched as the vampire book that we've all been waiting for, and I personally think that it delivered. It was very bloody and gory, but it was done in a way that felt very cinematic and was very in keeping with the kind of Gothic vibes of the story. This book is also illustrated, which is a lovely addition to the story. I feel like that's quite unique. I don't think I've read any adult books that are illustrated actually, and the artwork in here is just gorgeous. It was done by the very talented Von Orthwick. And it again just adds to the Gothic kind of vibes of this story. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this one and would recommend if you're looking for a gritty vampire story. Okay, in complete contrast to Empire of the Vampire, the next book that I want to talk to you about is The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. So this is such a warm, fuzzy hug of a book. I know it's a lot of people's favourite, so I'm sure you've probably heard of this one before, but this is basically a story about a man called Linus Baker, who is a caseworker for the department in charge of magical youth. So the department in charge of magical youth are basically in control of all of these orphanages that house these magical children, and the job of the caseworkers is basically to go and visit these different orphanages to make sure that they are all running safely, they're all running smoothly, and they are all abiding by the rules that are set out by this organisation. And the story kind of kicks off when our main character Linus is called up by extremely upper management, and he is basically sent on this really high profile job to go and check up on this classified orphanage known as the House in the Cerulean Sea to make sure that it is all running smoothly. And the reason why it is such a high profile job is because this orphanage is actually home to some very dangerous magical children. So extremely upper management want Linus to go and make sure that everything is running smoothly and determine whether or not they should close this orphanage down if it is too unsafe. And yeah, this turns into such a wonderful, wonderful story. It's basically about Linus kind of breaking out of the rut that he's in, and his experience of moving into the house in the Cerulean Sea really makes him start to question his own prejudices and his own preconceptions, and also makes him kind of question the rules that he's always lived by. And it turns into just such a beautiful, beautiful story. The characters in here are what makes it. They're all wonderful. All of the children are so unique and have their own little distinct personalities, and there's also a lovely sort of queer romance as well in here, which is gorgeous to see as well. This is so, so lovely. If you haven't yet read this one, you need to. It will fill your heart with happiness. It is just so lovely. Okay, so that brings me to the final book on my list, which is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. So this is a beautiful standalone adult fantasy book, and in this story we follow our main character, who is an older gentleman, and he goes back to his childhood home for a funeral, and he ends up kind of driving off to get away from everything for a little while, and he finds himself back at this house where he spent a lot of his childhood years, and when he goes back to this house, memories start coming back to him, and he starts to kind of recall some of the traumatic events that happened to him as a child. And so this story is basically told through the eyes of a 7-year-old, and it's basically kind of him recounting the events that happened to him, and it is truly wonderful. It's a gorgeous blend of different genres in here, because we've got fantasy, we've also got magical realism, we've also got a little bit of science fiction in here, so it is such an interesting kind of blend of things. And what I really enjoyed about this story is how you can kind of take from it what you will, so you can interpret it how you like. The way that I chose to interpret it was that this was kind of an exploration into how a child might kind of cope with some traumatic things that happen to them. So for example, I feel like a lot of the kind of fantastical things that happen in this story are kind of a coping mechanism. It's kind of how the main character as a young boy is using his imagination to understand what is going on around him, and it is truly fascinating. It's also quite dark at times. There are a lot of really, really heavy themes, trigger warnings for child abuse in here, but also yeah, it's quite scary, but it's also very beautiful as well. There's also a lot of themes of kind of family and friendship and love in here, and it's just something that will really stick with me, and this is definitely the kind of book where I would read it again and probably take something new from it each time I read it. So yeah, I would highly recommend this book. Gorgeously written as well, beautiful prose, and now I basically want to go on and read all of Neil Gaiman's work, because that's how much I loved this book. So yeah, that brings me to the end of this video. That was my top 10 books of 2021. I could not recommend these books highly enough. I think they are all wonderful. Please let me know if you've read any of them before. I would love to know your thoughts on them. Please also let me know what your favourite books of last year are, because I would love to have some recommendations from you. And yeah, I wish you all the best, and I guess I'll see you next time with another video. Bye!